The cursed mirror. It was the first time I'd been back to my grandmother's house since she passed away. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something or someone is watching you. The air smelled of old wood and dust, with a faint hint of lavender, the way it always had. But this time, it felt different. My parents were still sorting out the will, so they sent me to grab a few things from the house. It was just me, alone in that big, creaky old place on Willow Street, a few blocks away from the local cemetery. I never liked staying there overnight, not even when I was younger. The house always seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't explain. I was supposed to collect a few personal items, mainly the jewelry box my grandmother had always kept in her bedroom. As I made my way up the narrow staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway remained empty, the dim light from the single bulb casting long shadows on the walls. When I reached her bedroom, I froze. There, against the wall, was the mirror. I hadn't seen it in years. It had always been in my grandmother's room, a huge, ornate thing with a golden frame that seemed out of place among her modest furniture. As a child, I'd always been uncomfortable around it. It felt like the kind of object that saw you, even when you weren't looking at it. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand. The jewelry box was right where my mum had said it would be, on top of the dresser. But as I reached for it, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A movement in the mirror. I turned to face it, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I saw nothing. Just my own reflection, standing there, wide-eyed and scared. But as I looked closer, I noticed something. Behind me, just over my shoulder, there was a shadow. A figure, faint but definitely there, standing in the reflection. I spun around, but the room was empty. My breath quickened as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, but now it was clearer. It was a woman, tall and thin, her face twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. She was looking directly at me, her eyes dark and hollow. I stepped back, nearly stumbling over my feet, and a woman in the mirror smiled. That smile, it was my grandmother's, but it wasn't her. This thing, whatever it was wearing her face, but it was twisted, distorted, as if it was mocking her memory. The smile stretched too wide, the skin pale and tight over her bones, and the eyes, dark, sunken, filled with something malicious. A cold rush of fear flooded through me, chilling my spine to the core. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't tear my gaze from the mirror. I blinked, hoping I was imagining things, but when my eyes opened, she was closer. No longer just a shadow in the background. She was standing right behind me in the reflection, her bony fingers inches from my shoulder. I gasped and spun around, but the room was empty. Just me and the silence. My breath came in shallow, trembling gasps as I faced the mirror again. She was still there, waiting for me. Her face loomed larger, taking up more of the reflection, as if she was inside the glass, trying to push through. Then, the figure in the mirror began to move. Her long, thin fingers reached up and pressed against the inside of the glass, as though it were a window instead of a reflection. I could hear a faint, scraping sound as her nails dragged across the surface. My heart pounded harder, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. I stepped back, my voice caught in my throat. She smiled wider, showing her teeth. Sharp, jagged, far too many of them for a human mouth. Her eyes, Those black, hollow eyes bore into mine. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. Then, slowly, her mouth began to move. She wasn't speaking. No words came from her lips, but the mirror creaked. The glass groaned, warping and bending like it was under pressure, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It was as if the air itself had thickened, trapping me in place. I could barely breathe. And then I heard it. A faint whisper coming from the mirror, low and rasping, like the sound of dry leaves brushing against stone. It was my name.
Jack!
My blood turned to ice. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I took a step back, then another. My eyes glued to the mirror as the figure pressed harder against the glass, her mouth still moving, still whispering my name.
Jack!
The air grew colder, and I felt a sharp gust brush past me, as though something had moved through the room. My skin prickled with fear. I knew, in that moment, that whatever was in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was something else, something older and darker than I could understand, and it wanted me. The room around me seemed to shift, the shadows growing longer, the light dimming, even though no one had touched the switch. I could hear the wind howling outside, but the sound seemed distant, muffled. The only thing that mattered was the figure in the mirror. Her cold, dead eyes locked on mine, her thin fingers still scraping, pressing against the glass like she was trying to break free. I forced myself to move, inching backward until my legs hit the bed. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, and the mirror, no matter where I looked, it was there. I couldn't escape it. I could feel it pulling me, tugging at the edges of my mind, beckoning me closer. Then, without warning, the glass cracked. A thin, jagged line split across the surface, and a sound like ice breaking filled the room. I gasped, stumbling back, but my eyes never left the mirror. The figure, my grandmother, smiled wider, and for the first time, I saw her mouth open. She mouthed something I couldn't hear, but the meaning was clear.
Come closer!
I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. My legs refused to move, but every instinct in me screamed to get out, to run as far from that mirror as possible. But I couldn't. I was stuck, drawn toward it like a moth to a flame. The crack in the glass widened, and suddenly, the room was filled with an ear-piercing shriek. It wasn't human. It was something raw, primal, filled with rage and despair. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was everywhere, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air itself. The figure in the mirror twisted, her face contorting into something monstrous, her mouth stretching impossibly wide, as if she was screaming along with the sound. I fell to my knees, unable to think, unable to breathe. The mirror shook violently, the cracks spreading like a spider web. With a final burst of strength, I scrambled to my feet and ran, not out of the room, but toward the mirror. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy brass candlestick from my grandmother's dresser, and without thinking, I swung it at the glass with all my might. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, the shards exploding across the room. The shrieking stopped instantly, replaced by a deafening silence. I stood there, panting, my hands trembling, staring at the broken mirror. For a long moment, I just stood there, waiting, half expecting her to reappear in the shards scattered on the floor. But there was nothing. Only my reflection, my real reflection, staring back at me from the jagged pieces. I took a shaky breath and backed away, leaving the room in silence. Whatever had been in that mirror, it was gone now.
Ensure your horror fix. Subscribe now, hit that bell to stay notified of new terror-filled releases.